Hey Siri, define pollution.
Pollution means the presence in or introduction into the environment of a substance or thing that has harmful or poisonous effects.
Hi, and welcome to the Earth Focus podcast by Ground Zero Radio and EnAct. My name is Kenneth Tran. I'm a student at Sammamish High School, an officer for EnAct, and a creative director for Ground Zero Radio. And with me are...
Hi, I'm Benjamin Mousseau. I'm from Interlake High School's Green Team.
I'm Mashani Coleman. I'm from BSU and SOAR at Sammamish High School, and I'm also part of GZ Radio.
Hey, I'm Laurie Devereaux. I work for the city of Bellevue and run the Stream Team program.
Hi, I'm James Roubal. I'm the program coordinator for Washington Coastsavers and the Olympic Coast chapter of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation.
And hi, I'm Michael Diamond. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington's Department of Atmospheric Sciences, where I study the interaction between pollution particles in the atmosphere and clouds and how that affects our climate.
Yes, so Earth Focus is a three-part discussion podcast series between students and guests with environmental backgrounds. Every episode we cover one environmental topic, those being pollution, climate change and ocean acidification, and environmental justice. And for this episode, we'll be discussing pollution. But before we can get into that, what even is pollution?
Pollution is the presence in or introduction into the environment of a substance or thing that has harmful or poisonous effects.
Right, so that's the definition. But when you think about it, pollution is something that's kind of been happening for a long time. Like even in ancient times, human waste and smoke from fires posed some pollution issues. But the current environmental issues of pollution that we really think of nowadays really started to take off only about 200 to 300 years ago in the Industrial Revolution, which is when economies across the world learned how to manufacture a lot more things really quickly, but they did it using coal and often in a way that released toxic chemicals. So clearly pollution's like a really broad concept, right? And there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of think about it. So one way is by kind of where the pollution occurs, for example, water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution. But then another way is by kind of the type of bad thing that we're emitting into the environment, otherwise known as the type of pollutant. So for example, plastic pollution, chemical pollution, even noise pollution, light pollution, and thermal pollution are all issues we face nowadays.
Yeah, and to help us discuss this topic of pollution, we have a few guests with us. So if you guys would just explain a little about what you do. I know you already introduced what you're part of, but what do you do on a daily basis or as part of your job or what you study?
Sure. Well, this is Laurie Devereaux with the city of Bellevue. I run the Stream Team program in the Utilities Department in water quality. And so my job is really to help people prevent pollution, water pollution. I'm focused mostly on stormwater. As the city is very developed and there's a lot of hard surfaces, we look 200 years back for how a lot of this pollution started. But in the city of Bellevue, we're looking for water quality about 1970, when the city really became a lot more developed, a lot more hard surfaces, and all that water runs off into our stormwater system and into our streams. So I help educate the residents and the commercial properties on how to prevent pollution. And I also run a volunteer program where citizens get involved in learning about and helping others learn about water quality and our streams and the importance of ecology.
That's great. So, hi guys, I'll go next. My name is James Roubal again with Washington Coastsavers, and we're an alliance of partners and volunteers who are dedicated to keeping the beaches clean of marine debris through coordinated beach cleanups, education, and prevention efforts. So, for Coastsavers, it's the alliance is comprised of partners like Olympic National Park, Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission, Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, NOAA Marine Debris, Clallam County Waste, Lions Club International, Surf Rider Foundation. So we're really just this huge alliance of different partners, and we coordinate three major cleanups throughout the year. That's Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup in September each year, the Earth Day cleanup around in April each year, and then we do a big 5th of July cleanup when people to clean up firework debris and all of that. And so we clean up a lot of debris all on the outer coast. We do over 60 beaches, so all the way from Long Beach and then up to Nia Bay, and then all the way across the Strait of Juan de Fuca as well. So all the way from Nia Bay by the Makah tribe and then to Port Townsend. And then we do some smaller cleanup efforts in Seattle and the Puget Sound as well. And then real quick, for the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, we are the nonprofit partner to Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, which is, I like to describe it as the kind of like a national park of the ocean. So they're marine protected areas, and there are restrictions for shipping and for fishing and for stuff like that. And it's to protect our coastline. So it's 3,000 square miles of protected coastline out, extending to Nia Bay and then down to Pacific, just north of Pacific Beach. They're kind of like blue parks. They're awesome. You should. There's 14 in the U.S. and we're one of them, so it's pretty special.
That's awesome, James. So as a graduate student, I spend most of my time on research, and specifically research on air pollution and its interaction with the climate. As I mentioned, I do that through a couple different main ways. One is through observations. So I've been involved in projects that we actually take aircraft and fly directly through clouds and plumes of smoke actually from agricultural fires off the western coast of Africa to see how it's affecting clouds over the Southeast Atlantic Ocean. I've been on 3 campaigns looking at that. I also use observations from satellites that are orbiting around Earth, monitoring different types of things in the atmosphere and on the land and in the oceans. So actually one of the projects I did there was looking at ship emissions. As James mentioned, ships can form or spew out harmful pollution both into the air, and that can also get into the water. So we've been able to monitor some of those effects through satellite observations. And I also use what we call numerical models, or essentially computer models of how clouds work. So we have lots of lines of code that detail the physics of clouds, and we can run experiments on our computer for how those clouds would respond to different changes in pollution or different changes in how warm the atmosphere is, et cetera.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So let's just get into our discussion portion now that we've introduced everyone. So if anyone has questions for each other, feel free to go ahead and ask them throughout the discussion, and whether that's students for the guest or with just anyone in the podcast. So one of the questions to get us started is, what are the benefits of protecting like bodies of water from water pollution?
I'll say for us, so when we deal with marine debris, and just real quick to define marine debris, we like to define it as any persistent solid material that's manufactured or processed that can directly or indirectly, intentionally or unintentionally dispose of or abandoned into the marine environment or Great Lakes. So for us, a lot of the negative impacts of marine debris and plastic pollution have posed serious threats to marine life. Think of a lot of our humpback whales who migrate from Alaska down to Hawaii, and they can become entangled in a lot of this pollution, and a lot of it, it's from fishing nets as well, so they can really become entangled in it and lose their lives. But then, when you think of plastic pollution, it can break down in small pieces, and there's a thing called bioaccumulation, where plastic accumulates and say like a small fish eats plastic, and then as a bigger organism eats that fish, they're going to have that plastic as well. And that can cause a serious threat to humans too, as we rely on seafood. There's actually studies that show even like razor clams and other shellfish have microplastic in it, the really small plastic. And something that I've learned in this field since I've started a few years ago, it's crazy, every plastic ever produced still exists in some form today. So it's, people think, I think the biggest challenge for us is people think recycling is like the end all be all sometimes, but really only, I think like something like 9% of plastic ever really gets properly recycled. And then clean beaches also have the benefit of increasing tourism rates. There's a lot of studies that show, especially Surfrider did an awesome study in Washington that shows, obviously tourists like and are attracted to cleaner beaches. So that has a huge benefit. And then marine debris and plastic also can cause serious poses to navigation and all of that for ships as well. So.
Yeah, we've done surveys of our citizens and asked them what they care about the environment, and the environment ranks very high. And when we ask folks, what do you do? What do you go out and you experience? And they often say, I go to Lake Washington, I go to Puget Sound, I go to the ocean. And our recreation and our passion and some of the connections we have with the environment are really connected to water and being outside. And so there's an ethic there that we like to protect those things that we really care about. And then just like, how does all the plastic get down to the beach? A lot of it starts way inland where we are, and a lot of the problems that are happening way out in the ocean and in Puget Sound start inland. So I'm part of my role is really getting people to look at what happens on your own property. This pollution that happens is not something that happens far off by other people. It's not me. It starts with us. It starts with our homes, our properties, our businesses, our schools, our day-to-day behaviors is how this stuff adds up.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because we've had, after the 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, there's a lot of plastic debris and other debris items showing up from the other side of the Pacific. And so we've had a lot of, that's what kind of my role in outreach as well, is a lot of people are asking, oh, where's this trash, where's this debris coming from? And people often like to point fingers and say, oh, it's on the other side, but I always like to explain, we're all relying on the currents, and a lot of our stuff goes over to the other side of the Pacific as well. So like you were saying, we really have to work with our inland systems as well.
Yeah, so I have a question about like the types of debris or types of water pollution that we're seeing. Is it more chemical, or is it like a mixture between, or like what different materials are very common that you may find with water pollution?
With water pollution, and if we really look at Bellevue and Lake Washington and Puget Sound, stormwater runoff from our roads is the #1 source of pollution, because those surfaces are hard, and when it rains hard, most of us have a stormwater system. So a system of grates, of stormwater grates and pipes that carry this water directly to our streams, lakes, and wetlands without treatment. So for most of our communities, stormwater and sewer are two separate systems. There are some old systems in Seattle and some other areas where you may have combined, which causes entirely different issues. But for most places, our road runoff, what comes off your roof, what comes out of your driveways, it all ends up in our streams, lakes, and wetlands. And some of the current research really points towards our vehicles. And right now there's a lot of interesting research about tires, but also just all the everyday things we do. Did you wash your car in the driveway? Did you pick up your pet waste? Are you using lawn chemicals? All of that bioaccumulation, like plastic in a whale, well, it all is coming, for the chemical part is coming from upstream. So as far as stormwater pollution, local stormwater pollution, it's largely chemical. And but we also have a big impact on the physical, on all those hard surfaces raise the temperature. They increase flow. They have other impacts on our natural areas.
Yeah, and I would say for the outer coast, a lot of what we're seeing, the biggest debris item that we find are plastic water bottles. That's #1. And then I would say styrofoam is also huge, because it just breaks into tiny, tiny pieces. And if you go to any beach cleanup, I'm sure you'll find a lot of styrofoam. And then a lot of fishing debris as well. So, whether that be derelict crab pots, fishing rope, and all of those things. So, but like petrochemicals make up 99% of all plastics, and they're really kind of like these versatile building blocks of modern life, and they come from fossil fuels, and they're in our clothes, our paper, our fertilizers, cleaning products, and everything. So and like I said before, only 9% of all plastic has ever really been properly recycled. So, and a lot of fossil fuel and big oil companies are planning to up plastic production during all of, in the next 20, 30 years. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that there's also some interesting connections between air pollution and Water quality, especially in the chemistry. So this was more of a big deal in the 1970s and 1980s and early 90s in terms of acid rain, where things that you would emit into the atmosphere would rain out. That really hurt forests, but it also really hurt streams and rivers. And if we even think about the ocean as a whole, right now, all of the carbon dioxide pollution we're spewing out is acidifying the oceans as well, which I know you're talking about in another episode. So those are all another factor to that.
Okay, I want to open up. That's really interesting. I want to open up the discussion to both Benj and Mashani. If you have any questions or comments, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, sure. So I actually had one question for you, Michael. So you mentioned you talk about, or you research like shipping and those related pollutants. So I feel like I heard somewhere that shipping or ship emissions actually somehow counteract global warming in some way. Can you tell me more about that? Like, is that true in any way? And what does that tell us about what we should be doing about those ship pollutants?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. And when I think about air pollution, I kind of divide it into two separate things that it's doing to the world. One is it's harming human health directly. And the other thing is it's actually influencing the climate. So I'll focus on that one right now, because that's related to your question. So one form of pollution that is also really relevant for human health is particulate matter. So this is really tiny particles. They could be liquid, they could be solid, they can be of a couple different types of chemicals that get into the atmosphere. So these themselves, they can interact with sunlight. Some of them will reflect sunlight back to space, and some of them absorb sunlight, but the reflecting ones are actually more important overall. So the more of these little reflective particles you have in the atmosphere, the less sunlight you have, and that actually has a little bit of a cooling effect. That cooling can be even amplified more by how those interact with clouds, and in particular with clouds that are made of liquid water. If you look outside and just look at the clouds that are out there right now, every single of the millions of cloud droplets within that cloud have to be seeded by one of these atmospheric particles. And when you have only a couple of those particles in the atmosphere, like before you have a lot of air pollution, the water in the clouds distributed over a couple of really big droplets that tend to rain out more easily. When you increase the amount of pollution that's around, so if you're thinking like over the remote ocean where there aren't other pollution sources, if you imagine a ship going by and spewing out some air pollution, now you can have lots and lots and lots of tiny little droplets instead. And it turns out that that makes the clouds brighter or more reflective, which means you're reflecting more sunlight, and that actually has a cooling effect. So I've actually, one of my studies that I completed earlier this year was looking at ships that were going through this major shipping corridor between Europe and Northern Africa to Southern Africa, and they all kind of go in this line through the Southeast Pacific. And you can see in the satellite measurements right along that line, the clouds, as we can measure from space, have more droplets in them, and they're a little bit brighter. And that ultimately leads to a cooling effect of the units we use here are called 2 watts per meter squared. That's that cooling expressed as an energy unit. And to put that in perspective, if you were to go outside and just double the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere today, that would be about 4 watts per meter squared. And obviously that's very local right there, but it's a really big local impact. And if you take climate model estimates, so you can look at the latest generation of global climate models, and we do what we call historical runs. So you start at about 1850 and simulate up to the present day, and you can think about how has pollution changed since then as we put into our climate models. If you use the same relationships that you can get from the satellite measurements in that Southeast Atlantic shipping area and scale it up globally and scale it up for all different sources of air pollution, you find that just these, this cloud brightening effect offsets about a third of the warming that we would have experienced from greenhouse gases in the atmosphere alone. And this is actually really important, not just because of what it's doing now, but because this is one of our biggest sources of what we call in science uncertainty, which is essentially one way to think about it is the error bars, or we can say that we expect the world to warm up between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius or something like that for a doubling of warming. That spread, a lot of that is because we don't know exactly how much of the warming we could have experienced due to greenhouse gases has been masked or partially offset by cooling due to pollution.
Wow, that's crazy. I guess I feel like a lot of people haven't necessarily like heard of that, but upon like first hearing about it, I guess my first thought is, well, so if all of this cooling, I guess, is being caused by like ship pollutants, then should we be saying raw ship pollutants right now because it's kind of counteracting global warming, or I don't know, like where's the trade-off on that?
My answer would be probably not, and that gets to our other impact of air pollution, which is its really direct health impact. So there are some recent studies, if you're just looking at these particulate emissions outdoors, we could be looking at up to about 10 million excess deaths per year, where that phrase, quote unquote, excess deaths would mean more deaths than we would expect normally just because of these outdoor air pollutants, because they harm your lungs, they can also harm your heart, and they also make you more susceptible to different kinds of diseases. So one thing we've found, this is obviously very preliminary research because the coronavirus pandemic is still ongoing, but preliminary results have suggested that counties that have higher levels of this particulate matter pollution have a higher mortality rate or a higher death rate due to the coronavirus than others. And this also partially helps to explain some of the racial disparities in health outcomes, and in particular health outcomes with the coronavirus, because we know that especially African-American communities are exposed to more particulate matter in their environment than any other group in the United States.
Yes, so you mentioned about how pollution is affecting public health, and could you elaborate more on that? Because I've heard, of course, with air pollution, there's some statistic by the WHO that shows that air pollution is killing like millions of people per year, or creating complications that do so, and it's one of the greatest or biggest killers. And I've also heard that air pollution or living in more polluted areas for a long period of time creates more cases of asthma as well.
Yeah, those are both entirely correct. So you can imagine you have these little particles. So what we often use in the scientific literature to describe these airborne particles, we use this kind of weird sounding term called PM 2.5. And that stands for, the PM is particulate matter, but that 2.5 is really important. That is the diameter. So it's 2.5 microns, where 1 micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So super duper tiny, and these particles are actually small enough that when you breathe them in, they can go from the air that you're breathing straight into your lungs, and that's where they can do their damage. That's partially why these can be so bad for lung cancer, for your exposure to respiratory illness more generally. And actually, there's one really interesting statistic I thought. So if you look at pollution differences between northern and southern China, where over the 2000s or so, China's become one of the most polluted countries on Earth. They have estimated that there is a decrease in life expectancy of about 3 years for someone who lives in northern China versus someone of similar characteristics who lived in southern China, just because of that particulate air emissions or air pollution there.
Hi guys. Yeah, we had to take a little break for a little bit because of Zoom call reasons. So anyone have last we left off, we were talking about how public health is affected by pollution, specifically air pollution. But if anyone has any more comments or inputs to talk about whether that's air pollution solely or other different types of pollution, because I know with water pollution and with water pollution that can also affect public health as well. So if anyone has anything to add about that.
Drinking water is not my specialty, but I am involved in water quality in the rest of my group. And here in those of us who are purveyors of Seattle's water districts, Seattle Public Utilities, we get our water from the Cedar River and the Tolt River, and they are really protected, pristine environments. And we are privileged in this area to have the water quality, the drinking water quality that we do, and the treatment and the delivery that we do. But a lot of these issues have severe consequences for people who are getting their water from shared systems like the Mississippi, from people that, take from the top and people who take from the bottom. And that we all live downstream. And I was just saying during the break that I just learned a lot about clouds. I've never thought about clouds much since college, other than how pretty they are. And that a lot of our issues are really interconnected, and it's important to remember.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, I'll plug in a great documentary to watch, this story of plastic, if you guys ever want to watch that. And they do a really good job of talking about how a lot of big plastic companies and big oil companies are, their factories are generally polluting in, like Michael was saying earlier, communities of color, and it's disproportionately impacting those communities, and it's leading to a lot of respiratory issues and other horrible diseases. So yeah, it's an issue. It's something that needs to be addressed. And for water quality too, it's obviously, we're seeing a lot of issues with our salmon and our orcas as well. So that will continue to be problems if we're not addressing these things in the right and fast manner.
Well, I think of the bioaccumulation of the air quality issues affecting human health. All the water quality issues really affect aquatic life and the health of salmon and different fish and mammals and birds that rely on it, and they bioaccumulate in our whales and our larger species. So it definitely has the similar impacts of making them more susceptible to other problems.
For sure.
This actually all reminded me of another link between pollution and climate change, besides just carbon pollution, obviously. But one pollutant we don't often think about is salt, which obviously you want your seawater to be salty, but you don't want your drinking water to be salty. So in a lot of coastal communities, so you can think of Florida, you can think of other places around the world like Bangladesh, both because of rising sea levels and also because we've been pumping water from underground to use for drinking. There's been encroachment of seawater inland towards where the water that we drink is. And that's a huge, huge risk to human health if you start getting salty water in your wells. Those aren't going to be usable anymore, which means you might have to go to riskier and riskier water sources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've heard a little bit about that actually. So I think we should also talk about how different communities are being affected by pollution, and like the different disparities in like the difference between, because obviously here in Washington, we're going to be affected by pollution far differently than someone, say, in the Philippines or in Manila. So
yeah, I'll say for at least plastic, we were shipping a lot of our plastics over to China and the other side of the Pacific for a long time until they started to get fed up with us because we're sending over materials that aren't cleaned properly. And it's really interesting. A lot of people, again, like I was saying earlier, like to point to those countries on the other side of the Pacific and blame them for plastic ending up in the ocean. But a lot of their systems just cannot handle all of the amount of plastic that all these other countries are sending them. And the big oil companies are often targeting these countries and like different ads and other things to create more, like think of shampoo bottles or everything else that they or candy wrappers, anything they have there. So it's a complicated issue. And I'll say also in Washington, we work a lot with the 4 coastal treaty tribes, the Quinault, the Quileute, the Ho, and with like Jamestown's Clallam tribe, and they they don't really see plastic pollution as like they don't see it as, they see it as more a problem coming from like white communities. They're like, this is not our plastic. Like this is not coming from us. So it's, you know, we stick bag bans and stuff too. It's always we have to be inclusive with what we're doing. Members from like the McCall tribe and such use different plastic bags and stuff, you know, when they go out to the grocery, and they can't always rely on you know, all of the alternatives. So we have to have like inclusive programming as well when we're pollution, at least. So it's a multifaceted issue, and we really need to be listening to all sides.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, you know, the city that you guys live in is Bellevue. We're a majority city, and it really impacts the outreach that we do and trying to reach all levels and different cultures and different people in our community. And it's a challenge, and I've just am so happy that it's more embraced now, and that it's a way that we can help everybody just even understand, because no one does these things like, I hate the environment, I'm going to throw my water bottle out the door. It's just like, well,
Yeah.
what are the problems? How can we help people get to where they need to be? And where is the source coming from? Is it coming from the back of a building, or is it coming from the average homeowner? And where are the sources of these problems? And how can we help people change these problems? How can we communicate in a different way and understand where other people are coming from? It happens a lot with hazardous waste and toxics that you know, the people that are exposed to a lot of this don't understand what some of it is, and it's our responsibility really to help prevent their exposure and prevent it for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so another thing I want to add, shifting a little more toward air pollution as well. I heard so I was listening to a podcast by the Sierra Club, and they were talking about these area codes which were given, or housing is more common for people of color because it's right next to a factory, and people want to live there unless you have to. They have to live in that area code where it's right next to a factory, and they're more exposed to air pollution. What are cities doing? Because of course, Laurie, you work with the city of Bellevue. So what are cities doing to help combat, you know, pollution?
Yeah, so there's two different sides of it. Some of it is the voluntary. It is our city council saying that, you know, we really care about climate change, and we want the city to have a climate change initiative, and we want the city to have goals to protect the environment. And then a big part of what my department does, my division within utilities, is regulatory. It is making sure the city is in compliance with the rules that help protect our water quality, our environment, and also helping our citizens and our commercial businesses comply. And that's a big part of doing inspections, understanding the code, creating the code, and making people follow the rules. And a big part of my job is just educating, because often people don't understand that the stormwater system is separate from the sewer system. And just having that conversation alone, it makes a big difference. So regulatory is a big part of it. There's times when we only just need to educate people, but there's another level of what are the rules and how do we hold people to these rules and help them understand why. And that is a lot of that we all live downstream, and we have an impact on a much broader array of humanity than we usually think of.
Yeah, so another perspective of how, moving to another perspective of how we as like, you know, the normal average citizen, what we can do to combat pollution. Well, James, maybe you could answer this a little more since you're with Coastsavers. So what are some things we can do to help with the efforts against pollution?
Yeah, I always say it's, you know, it's really important to call people in instead of calling them out. So help people find alternatives, invite them to a local beach cleanup. You know, and beach cleanups are not the end all be all solution to plastic pollution by any means. They're really a plastic band-aid, or sorry, not plastic band-aid, but they're a band-aid to our, you know, our big issue with plastic pollution. But other things, you know, I think something that really opened my eyes was just touring a local recycling facility and really seeing a behind the scenes of how it all works. It's really eye-opening, and it's one thing to hear it, but then to go and see, like, when I was there, they were explaining how our plastic grocery bags, they're so flimsy, so if you just have like one, it gets caught up in the system and it jams it, and they have to stop the facility for hours each day to just get those bags out. It's interesting though too, if you like tie them all together, they bounce more on the stream, but if they're just individual, then it causes it to jam. But there's other things like jeans were another thing in clothes that really jammed the machines as well. So it's really interesting. But there's so many other things I think we could do. Of course, there's all the things that we always talk about, like eating low on the food chain and eating locally, reducing your carbon footprint, composting correctly, and encouraging for public transit and all of those things, buying vintage or recycled fashion. I think considering writing to companies, it's really great to do a lot of these individual actions ourselves, but I think we should also place some pressure on the systems in place and question those too, because we're all individuals, but as a collective whole, there's so much more power if we can really encourage a lot of these companies to change the way that they're producing plastic. And I know Coca-Cola just came out and they said they're going to try to create compostable items by 2023. So, the more we can do things like that, I think it'll really make a difference.
Yeah, so we're running a little low on time now. I know, Benj, I know you prepared like a final question that we can go around and each of us could answer or provide an answer to.
Sure, yeah. So I guess like a lot of the time when we talk about the environmental issues in general, but also specifically pollution, it can feel like, oh no, the orcas are dying and plastic still being pumped out. But I guess just generally, like, what's one beacon of hope, I guess, that each of you can share for water pollution, like how things might go forward in a positive light?
Yeah, so maybe I can start about like my idea of like, a glimmer of hope in like this giant global problem that all of us are affected by, and it seems really difficult to solve. So for me, it's that people are educated about it now. I mean, in elementary school, I was educated about different types of pollutions, and that was really cool to see. And it allows people to actually act on the issue. And, because if you understand something more, you're more willing to actually act on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Kenneth. I think it's really important that people are educated now, and a lot of people are advocating for it on social media. And I wasn't really educated, but now that everyone's like more aware of what they're doing and how to improve their carbon footprint, it helps others in their community around them.
Yeah, I would say something that gives me hope is that we do have a track record of being able to make a big difference when we put our minds to it. So if you think back to the 60s or 70s, you had rivers on fire. And obviously since then, with the clean air and clean water laws that have been passed in the United States and in Europe, you had really big reductions in pollution. And even in countries like China, which, as we mentioned before, is oftentimes blamed fairly or unfairly for different types of pollution problems. Since 2013, when they had one really big, horrible haze event that winter, they instituted a really strong clean air rule right after that. And between 2013 and the present, you have seen really dramatic drops in particulate emissions, in the amount of sulfur they put into the atmosphere, and a couple other air pollutants. So we do have a track record of, if we decide as a society that this is something we want to prioritize and want to do something about, we have the tools to be able to make a dent.
Yeah, I have to say, Michael, I'm originally from Cleveland, where the Cuyahoga River was on fire multiple times. So yeah, it's really, that gives me hope too. We're seeing plastic bag bans pop up all around the country. Washington State actually just became the 8th state in the nation to pass a plastic bag ban. There's a lot of momentum. A lot of people are gaining awareness around this issue. But something personally that's really motivating to me is just working with all the volunteers. So we see over 2,000 volunteers annually coming out to our outer coast in these really remote areas, helping pick up really big pieces, heavy debris pieces, tires, pieces of cars, derelict fishing gear and ropes. And one of our volunteers said she's been taking her kids there since, they were pretty much able to walk. And her one kid's grown up now, but he came back from France and participated in one of the beach cleanups this year. So yeah, it's just, the dedication from people is just really inspiring. And that's something that keeps me positive every day.
So I say ditto to that, especially the volunteers. They're incredibly inspiring when you see entire generations of family getting involved. But I got to say, looking back and now looking forward at your generation, the younger generation, and how much information is available there, and your guys' ability and interest in looking critically at it, and that you're our next voters. So I'm excited for what you're going to do, because I have a lot of hope in you.
Ditto.
Yeah, and I'll say on that same track, I think the current generation is a lot more aware of these linkages between air pollution and climate change and different aspects of environmental justice more broadly. So that does give me hope that there might be future ways of looking at these as more interconnected, and that might make it more, it might improve our ability to actually solve all of them at the same time.
Yeah. And then would you like to provide an answer to, even I know it's your question, but would you like to answer as well?
I don't think I can follow all that. that was heartwarming.
Just promise to vote.
Yes, I promise to vote. There you go.
All right, I think that's our end. That's the end of our pollution episode for Earth Focus. Tune in next time, or on June 9th and 16th, when our Climate Change and Ocean Acidification podcast and our Environmental Justice podcast comes out. If anyone has any plugs or what we should look at, just for the listeners, feel free to share them.
You guys can follow us on Washington Coastsavers. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Olympic Coast Foundation's also on Facebook, and we're starting an Instagram page. So yeah, come follow us, please, and come volunteer.
You can find Bellevue Stream Team on Instagram, but you can also go online to the web page for the city and look for the Kelsey Creek web camera, and you can look at Kelsey Creek, which those of you who live in town can just go down and see it. But you can also watch online and see what happens there over time, and it's a great view.
Yeah, and if you're interested more about climate change or atmospheric sciences, if you go to the University of Washington web pages for the Department of Atmospheric Sciences or the Program on Climate Change, you can look up my page, or you can look up a lot of the different kinds of research that my colleagues are doing as well.
All right, I think that pretty much does it. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.